We are now right at the beginning of the 9th generation of gaming consoles. The PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X have been released. With the Series X, Microsoft said they had the best launch ever for an Xbox console. The first one started out strong, with things really picking up during the 360 era, but the Xbox One struggled in comparison, so it's a promising start for them at the moment. But I think it's fun to look back, particularly when a new console comes out. This Where to Start guide will take a look at the hardware, accessories, and games of the original Xbox. And by the end, you should have a good idea on what the Xbox is all about. At the same time, it's also a sort of retrospective of the console. The Xbox is Microsoft's first gaming console. They certainly got the timing right, as it was released several months after Sega decided to pack it in and exit the console market. A familiar name faded away, and a new giant was emerging from the horizon. No, that's not a huge like Xbox joke, but I guess that somehow fits now that I think about it. The Xbox was quite innovative because it features a number of things that would later be standard in future console generations. Mainly a hard drive and an Ethernet port, though it's not the first console to have internet connectivity. Only later model PS2s ended up having an Ethernet port. The fat PS2 needed the HDD kit in order to have LAN connectivity, and well, of course, a hard drive as well. On the GameCube side of things, you needed an optional accessory for Ethernet connectivity. Something else the Xbox did, which was ahead of its time, is the subscription-based online service, Xbox Live. Now, that's perhaps not something people like, having to pay for online, but now Nintendo and Sony do it too, and this is where the concept was first implemented. In terms of hardware, Xboxes were basically Pentium 3 PCs. They were quite powerful, and a lot of times multi-platform games were best on Xbox and PC. I know of one game specifically, Splinter Cell Chaos Theory, that had two different versions of the game. The PC and Xbox games were the good ones, and the PS2 and also the GameCube versions used the older engines. Even the levels were simplified and laid out differently. These days people are complaining about PS4 and Xbox One games running at different resolutions, but at least you're actually playing the same game. The Xbox always had a reputation of being quite big, hence the old Xbox huge memes, if anybody remembers those. Interestingly, the Xbox never received a refresh, at least not in form factor, but things did change on the inside. Other than there being 8 and 10 GB models, there's also different optical drives. Some have better lasers than others, and in terms of modding, like if you want to run backup games from a CD, some can read more formats than others. As a console goes through its lifespan, it starts becoming more efficient with its power usage, and certain things sometimes end up being simplified for cost reduction purposes. An example of efficiency is the AC adapter. Mine has a massive wall plug. Later examples moved the power supply to the inside of the system because, well, they made space for it. I'll link a website that shows the different hardware revisions, which would be particularly useful for people looking into modding. It seems that original Xboxes do have a bit of a weakness, which is leaking caps, especially the one that keeps the date and time when the console is unplugged. People often remove them, which yes, means that you have to reset the time and day every time it's disconnected and reconnected to power. But that's easier to deal with than a motherboard that is irreversibly damaged by acid from a leaky capacitor. There's also kits available that you can buy that include all the caps you need. You just have to verify which motherboard it is before ordering. Obviously, those without soldering experience are going to find this task daunting, so perhaps not a job for beginners. Hard drives are also quite vulnerable to failure, but that's not unique to the Xbox, that's just hard drive things. The problem is that the hard drive is locked to the motherboard, so it's not as straightforward as just swapping drives. There's different procedures depending if the Xbox is functional versus the hard drive being dead. There's also the option of getting a mod chip to bypass the whole locking thing. That would also allow you to use IDE to SD card adapters for cheap solid-state goodness. My advice is to find one that works and plan ahead to do some preventative maintenance. It's kind of like buying a used car. Change the filters and fluids, but maybe invest in a timing belt, tensioner, and water pump too, because who knows when that was done last. Microsoft has made an effort with backwards compatibility, so it's worth bringing up that an Xbox 360, Xbox One, or the new Series X and S all can play original Xbox games to some extent. That being said, backwards compatibility isn't anywhere near being complete. It differs from console to console, but generally speaking, there's some big name games that are missing. So when it comes to original Xbox games, there's only a few instances where I'd recommend getting a newer Xbox. mainly if it's just something really specific that you want to play and it just happens to work on those ones. Something to note with the Xboxes are the controllers. There's two official ones. The first one is the original, also often referred to as the Duke, probably because it's gigantic. The Xbox Controller S is a revised regular-sized controller, and the one you'll probably prefer to use. It is the more common model as well. But if you have the chance to try both, then try both because you never know, you might like the huge one. The Xbox does also have optional memory cards, though I don't even remember ever using them for anything in particular. You can plug those into the controller, or a separate dongle do that plugs into one of the controller ports. Let's talk about games now. Out of all its contemporaries, the Xbox was the most powerful, so the best versions of multi-platform titles during that time were available on PC and Xbox. I enjoyed a lot of games during that era, so I'll mention some of my favorites. Some of the footage isn't Xbox footage, just so you know. Fable. It may not be the most refined game in the world, but I found it great fun. It's an action RPG where your decisions affect things like whether you're seen as a good or bad person. One of the funny things is how you can still do evil things, but not have the system pick up on it. For example, you can lead people into an area with enemies to kill them off, without getting any evil points. I've always enjoyed the fairy tale atmosphere that the Fable series provided. There isn't any RPG quite like Fable. There's a certain whimsical quality that many other games just don't have in that genre. Splinter Cell, Pandora Tomorrow, and Splinter Cell Chaos Theory. Those three games are absolutely amazing. This was the first generation of consoles that could utilize light and shadow in more complicated ways, and the Splinter Cell games took full advantage of that. I've always been a fan of stealth games, like Commandos or Jagged Alliance for example, but those are based on strategy games. Splinter Cell games are quite different to those that I just mentioned because you're in a comparatively smaller environment, and a lot of times you're maneuvering between several enemies in tight spaces. That creates a sort of tension that I really enjoy. A lot of times you're not hiding behind something physically, but rather you're just in the shadows. One stray flashlight, or perhaps somebody flicks on the lights and it's all over. There's a clear progression of improvement between the first three Splinter Cell games. Chaos Theory really took things to the next level though. The bump mapping looks great, and you get more options on how to complete each level. I think that one's my favorite game of the series. I played it so much back in the day. Need for Speed Underground 1 and 2. Many car enthusiasts around my age have been influenced by a variety of media, especially those with an interest in Japanese cars. Usually you hear a combination of Best Motoring Hot Version, Gran Turismo, Fast and Furious, and Top Gear. And that's certainly true for me, but another big influence were the Need for Speed Underground games. They were very popular, partly for having been highly influenced by the Fast and Furious movies. The Underground games are just such a great representation of that era. There seems to be a bit of nostalgia now for these kind of cars, even though most of us who played these games didn't like the way a lot of people modified their cars back then. But now it's fun to look at how ridiculous things can get. And despite perhaps not liking this style, there is now an appreciation of the workmanship. The music in both games is really iconic. Riders on the Storm, and of course the infamous menu song from the first game, Lil Jon's Get Low. Yes, good times running from the window to the wall, and then later doing obscene motions with your hand while running down the hallway. At least that's what happened in my high school. Mercenaries, Playground of Destruction. That game is an open-world action game set in North Korea. You play as a mercenary doing mercenary things. There's a reputation system, and you get to blow up a lot of stuff. I actually never played this game normally, but rather just with cheats. Make yourself invincible, give yourself a ton of money, buy whatever vehicles you want, and request any type of airstrike you'd like. Yeah, it's fun to just blow up stuff in this game. Carry cars around with a helicopter, drop them on other stuff and make them explode. Call in airstrikes and accidentally blow up the building you're standing on. All good times. Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time trilogy. I'm referring to Sands of Time, Warrior Within, and The Two Thrones, which I always think sounds like two toilets standing beside each other, but anyways. My favorite is Sands of Time. I think it's a really nice blend of action, puzzles, and story. There's a sort of mystical quality to the game and the story. I really like the tone. I also like how the game is paced, as the game switches back and forth from fighting to platforming and completing puzzles. This basically applies to all three games, but I wasn't a fan of the aesthetics of Warrior Within. It became all heavy metal and dark, which isn't something I'm fundamentally against. I'm a metalhead. but I just think the change in art style and tone of the story was really abrupt and unfitting with what's been established in Sands of Time, though it's still fun in terms of gameplay. Plus there's at least one other benefit. Two Thrones brought things back in line again, so I enjoyed that a bit more. Dead or Alive. There's actually several DOA games I could mention, but let's just focus on all of them at once, like as a whole. These fighting games had a lot of presence on the system. Because the Xbox was so powerful, it allowed for some really sophisticated graphics while also running at 60 frames per second, which is pretty impressive. Some of you may remember those video game review shows on TV, Extended Play or X-Play, as well as Electric Playground and Reviews on the Run. I can't quite remember which one of those it was, but I do remember seeing one of the DOA games on there, and the snow level really caught my attention. I wasn't into fighting games back then, but the way the game looked really made an impact. The snow physics was just something I've not seen before in a video game. And newer DOA games don't have that either, so I guess they're more busy trying to assault your wallet with DLC these days. But still, even today, the DOA games on Xbox still look good. It's not just looks though, as fighting games they've always felt very smooth to play, though I've never really got a hang of the counter system. That being said, that applies to most fighting games with me, so that's more of a me issue. The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. Now this is a game I probably wouldn't play on Xbox these days. I usually play Elder Scrolls games on PC, especially because you can mod out a lot of the game's wonkiness and frustrating bits, but it wouldn't make sense to not talk about it in this video. I do like the old school feel of Morrowind. There's certain things I wish Oblivion or Skyrim could have retained, like some of the skills for example. One of the things I enjoy with Morrowind is mainly exploring. Yes, you kinda do move slowly, but the permanent fog that hides the short rendering distance does mean that discoveries can be a bit more exciting than you'd think. I remember walking towards Vivek the first time and then having those otherworldly buildings slowly fade into view. It's a pretty cool experience, though it might not hit the same way as it did in the past. Halo 1 and 2. These are two of the most important games when it comes to modern first-person shooters on consoles. Perhaps the biggest contributions in terms of mechanics were the controls and online multiplayer. Aiming with the controller isn't very precise, so the aim assists really helped, and the online matchmaking always seemed to work well. Personally, Halo 2 was the first FPS multiplayer game that felt as fun to play as a PC shooter. And I think a whole lot of other people felt the same way, hence other popular FPS franchises adapting similar mechanics in their console ports. On another note, while I do really like World War II shooters, Halo was a breath of fresh air with its sci-fi setting back then, and the story was fun to follow. In fact, it's the only FPS I remember even bothering to follow the story of. GTA San Andreas. I always enjoyed Grand Theft Auto games. I started with the second one, which was still a top-down game, and since then I've played every single major release. While some people like Vice City, I personally think San Andreas is the best of the classic 3D series. 3 cities to roam around in, plus you even get rural areas to explore, which was totally new for GTA games. The variety in scenery is really great, and it feels like you're really covering some ground when going from one place to another. I also found the radio stations to be really enjoyable. There's a lot of different genres, and I particularly enjoyed the early hip-hop, also the gangster rap, alternative rock, and the electronic music, like the house music. I always found it interesting how soundtracks can be such a big part of the experience of a video game, and how even songs we normally wouldn't like become something we love because of the experience it's attached to. I think this was the first game that made me realize that that can happen. Those are just some of my favorite games you can play on the Xbox. There are of course more notable ones as well, like for example the first Forza game, Half-Life 2, Project Gotham Racing, or Ninja Gaiden. Those are all games that you'd find on top Xbox game lists on the internet, but the reason I didn't mention them is because I either haven't played them, or sometimes it's just limited experience I have with them. I thought it made sense to expand on games I actually had experience with. I definitely do recommend looking at best original Xbox games lists, since there's a lot you can find. Alright, I kind of mentioned modding in the hardware section, though not in detail. I haven't modded my system, though it might become a necessity if my Xbox's hard drive ever dies. There's several options on what you can do, soft modding to hard modding. As with many other consoles, the sort of things you can do with an Xbox are similar. For example, playing burnt discs or transferring games to the hard drive via FTP, just to name some examples there. I'm definitely not the authority when it comes to modding, so I don't want to spread around misinformation unintentionally. So what I'm going to do is list some resources for you to check out in the comments, or in the description rather. Speaking of comments, obviously if you know something about modding, you can mention it in the comments as well. Hopefully that'll point some people to the, or into the right direction there. But yeah, that's the Microsoft Xbox, a very interesting console that came in right when Sega was pulling out. It was a powerful console in its day and it had some great exclusives. Not to mention, it was quite innovative in several ways. I hope you enjoyed this look at the console. Let me know what you think of the system in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.